So again, this is, as Rich said, it's called a circumplex diagram, okay? And I want to emphasize that although it looks nice and pretty up here, it's not just a theoretical model, okay? This is data which has been collected from literally tens of thousands of people in dozens of different nations around the world, okay? So this seems to be the way that people's value structures or value systems are structured in their minds across many different nations. It's something which has been validated in rich and poor, east and west, north and south, about the only kind of culture in which, to my knowledge, this has not been tested, has been in indigenous cultures. I've never seen any data looking at values like this in an indigenous culture. But otherwise, this is pretty common across different folks. Here are the specific values that how Schwartz defines them. So universalism is understanding, appreciation, tolerance, and protection for the welfare of all people and for nature. And we'll just go with the value that's opposite it in the circumplex, which is power, social status and prestige, control, or dominance over people and resources. So I think you can see from these definitions why it's relatively difficult to simultaneously value them, why they're on opposite sides of the circumplex. It's hard to care about protecting the welfare of people at the same time you're trying to have dominance over them. Okay? So there's something that's psychologically in conflict or incompatible about these different sets of values. Now, around this circle, Schwartz has some higher level labels for these different values. And we're going to be focusing primarily here on this dimension because for most of the outcomes about which I'm guessing you care, and if you look back on the red and green dots over there, the dimension of the self-transcendence versus self-enhancement is where most of the action lies. Now, Schwartz calls these, the universalism and benevolence, the self-transcendence values, because they have, they concern things like caring about your family and friends and caring about the wider world. So things that transcend just yourself. Achievement and power, in contrast, Schwartz calls the self-enhancement values. So these are values which are really focused on trying to improve your own standing in the world, which is done through status and power and money largely. Now, another way to talk about these values comes from the work that my colleagues and I have done. We call the achievement and power values. We have a slightly different circumplex, which I'm happy to show you, but isn't in the slides today. But we call these values for money and power and status and image, we call them the extrinsic values. And we call them extrinsic because they're highly focused on external rewards, okay? You need somebody else to say, oh, don't you look good? You need somebody else to give you the money, okay? It's an external kinds of things. And we contrast these with what we call the intrinsic values, which include universalism and benevolence, but also in our framework they include the idea of freedom and choice and those kinds of things. We call them the intrinsic values because they're inherently satisfying to pursue for most people. You know, when you ask somebody why do they want money, well, they usually want money for some other thing, right? But the intrinsic values, why does somebody want love? Well, because they want to be loved, okay? It's an inherent satisfaction to pursue those intrinsic values, whereas extrinsic values are typically means to another end. And you see this reflected here in this diagram, that the intrinsic values are inherently rewarding and concern self-acceptance and creativity and such. Extrinsic values focused on approval or rewards, money, image, status, etc. Now, there are 5 basic principles with regard to how value systems work that I want to walk through next. So you'll remember that first we're still in what are values, how do values work. Later, after the break, we'll talk about how values develop and why they matter. Okay? But here are 5 fundamental things that we know about values from the empirical literature. The first is that values are universal, and I mean them being universal in 2 different ways. The first way in which I mean that they're universal I've already described, which is that we find these values structure across every different nation that we look at. Okay? Sometimes there's a little bit of shifting here and there, but pretty much wherever you go, you find that universalism and benevolence stand in contrast and in conflict to achievement and power, etc. So it seems to be something that's basic to the human motivational system. It's a fundamental part of being human, whether you live in Scotland or in China or in Brazil. This just seems to be how it is organized. So that's the first way in which it's universal. The second way in which it's universal is that we all have all of these values. Okay? So it's easy to think, oh, well, I'm a universalistically oriented person and my boss is a power-hungry person. Okay? And that may be, but it's also the case, I think, if you reflect, that there are times in your life, if you just think about the last 2 weeks, for example, of your life, and you think about a time when maybe you were focused on helping the world be a better place, and then you were thinking about focusing on someone you love, and then maybe a time when you were focused on your own achievement or power. I think we can all admit that what happens in our life is that we're moving from space to space in this circumplex, okay? We may have a certain gravity which pulls us back to our core values of whatever they happen to be, but there are times in life when I'm really very hedonistically focused, right? And there are other times in life when I'm very focused on security, and then maybe I move someplace else, okay? So this is the second way in which this circumplex is universal. And again, if it really is reflecting the basic human motivational system, that makes sense, right? We all have all of these motives. The second thing that I want to mention about values is that they aren't characteristics. So up here we have two very famous women, but only one of them probably cared about becoming famous. So just because they are both famous doesn't mean that they valued fame and that they valued popularity. Similarly, there are rich people who are very materialistic and focused on getting a lot of money, and there are rich people who really don't care a whole lot about money. So don't confuse somebody's standing with what they actually care about. And what we're talking about is not their standing, not their characteristics, but their desires, their guiding principles in life, what's important to them. The third thing, and now we'll be getting into somewhat more sophisticated psychological research here, has to do with the idea that values can be engaged. So remember that we all have all of these values. And what that means, psychologically speaking, is that it's possible to turn on those values in your psychological structure. Psychologists would call this activating values, or sometimes they would call it priming values. Now, I'm going to give you an example of this with regard to people who are extrinsically oriented. One of the battles that we've been fighting since we started doing this work a couple years ago has to do with certain social marketers who say that, okay, well, if you have a person who's very focused on money and status and image, the only way you're ever going to motivate that individual in order to do something that's good for the environment is to appeal to those values of money, status, and image. And we've argued on the basis of all of this research that no, extrinsically oriented people still have intrinsically oriented values, and that for reasons you'll see later, it's potentially dangerous to appeal to those extrinsic values, and it might be much better to appeal to the intrinsic values. And so, but our first point was just you can do this. And so what we did was we did a study where we surveyed the values of 700 adults in the United Kingdom around the Cardiff area. And we only selected for the next phase of our study the 30 people who were in the top 10% on their self-enhancing values. So we selected the people who were most focused on money and image and status out of these 700 individuals. Okay? Then what we did was we brought them into the lab and we randomly assigned them to one or another group. Half of the people were asked to write about why these intrinsic and self-transcendent values were either important or not so important to them. And then the other half had to write the same kind of idea, only about extrinsic values. Okay, so you're randomly assigned to this or this, but everybody is extrinsically oriented. It's just a matter of which values were activated. Then what we did was we had everybody go through a standardized interview with an interviewer who didn't know which group the person had just written their values about, so he's blind to that. And they were interviewed about 2 environmental topics, one local, one global, and 2 poverty-related topics, one local and one global. then what happened was a psycholinguist with a lot of experience, Paul Chilton, read all of these different transcripts. And he didn't know which group the people had been in. He also didn't even know what the primes were that we had given people. So he was completely naive to that. And he rated these transcripts of these interviews about these 4 important topics. First he rated them, well, is this person talking in a more self-transcendent way, or is this person talking in a more self-enhancing way? And what he found was that the people who had been primed with the extrinsic values were talking in a more self-enhancing way. The people who had been primed with the self-transcendent values were talking more self-transcendently, even though they were extrinsically oriented. Now that's sort of just a manipulation check. Oh, there's our little slides there, okay. Next what he did was he coded whether or not the person in talking about these 4 problems was saying, you know, this is a problem and somebody should do something about it, versus saying, no big deal, okay. What he found, again, was that the intrinsically oriented prime people were significantly more likely to say somebody should do something about this than were the extrinsically oriented prime people. He also then, if they said that there should be an action, he asked, well, why do they think there should be something done? So maybe they're concerned about climate change because of their own self-interest, their house is going to get flooded, or maybe they want to help other people. And again, what he found was that the intrinsically oriented people were more likely to say, you know, we need to help because we need to help people in other countries, whereas the extrinsically oriented people, to the extent they thought there should be something done, was for them. Now to really bring this alive, I want to show you a couple of quotes. So here we have extrinsically oriented people who've been primed to talk about these topics in extrinsically oriented ways. So here's somebody talking about child mortality in developing nations. And this person says, it's a part of life over there, it's the way of life, that's what happens, so it's nothing to get too upset about. Okay? An extrinsically oriented person who's been primed with extrinsic values. Here's somebody talking about climate change. Asked what would motivate him to do something. He says, I suppose money if there was a financial incentive to be more proactive. I do tend to switch things off, but that's more a case of me saving money and electricity than thinking, oh, that's going to help the world. So these extrinsically oriented people are talking in a very extrinsically oriented fashion, I hope you can see. But what about the extrinsically oriented people who are primed in an intrinsic way? Here's someone else talking about child mortality. I think they should stop. I mean, bonuses and the bankers, and it's publicized on the news, for goodness sake. It's back to the haves and the have-nots. So here she's talking in a social justice, inequality sort of way and saying that that's a problem. That's a more intrinsic approach for this extrinsically oriented person. Here's climate change. I do think that the earth and the environment is precious and valuable. I think it should be at the top of the political agenda. I think that the world that we pass on to the next generation, you know, is our responsibility. So it takes a little while for her to get it out. Okay? But she does. Okay? She's able to talk in this intrinsically oriented language once you've engaged that value with her. And we'll see again that there's important reasons why you would want to do that as we continue through the rest of the workshop here. The fourth thing I want to talk about with regard to how value systems work is what we call the seesaw effect, okay? And that's what you call here in Scotland the children's toy where there's the piece of wood on the fulcrum goes that way and that way, right? Okay. I've been traveling all over Europe and everybody calls it something different, but everybody knows the toy at least. Okay, the idea of the seesaw effect here is that as you engage one set of values on the circumplex, you actually end up suppressing the values on the other side of the circumplex. So to the extent that I engage people with universalistic values, actually what we're going to see is a suppression of achievement and power values, and vice versa. If we engage people in achievement and power, we would get a suppression of universalism. Let me show you some studies that show how this works. So what Greg Mayo did was he brought people into the lab and he had them get words that were on cards. Now the first group of people had a set of cards with words on them that had adjectives like red or clean. Some of the words had items of furniture like bed or desk. And then some of the words were benevolence-related words like forgiving, helpful, and honest. A second group had words that were adjectives, items of furniture, and achievement-related words. And a third group had adjectives, items of furniture, and control, food-related words. Okay? Then what he did, so what he's doing is he's activating, largely in an unconscious way, these different values in people's minds. Okay? Just by sorting these cards, people are being exposed to these value ideas. Then what he did was he had the experimenter say, you know, I'm really trying to get some more people to participate in my studies, but I can't offer you any more money. I can't offer you any extra credit. But would you sign up to be in some future studies, just to volunteer? And they wrote down how much time they were willing to volunteer. And what they found was that people who had sorted benevolence-related words volunteered about 40 minutes, which was significantly more than the control group at a half hour, but people who had sorted achievement-related words volunteered less, significantly less than the control group. Now, there was nothing in those achievement-related words which said, don't help. Okay? It was just by having that part of the circumplex engaged that there was a suppression on the other side of the circumplex. Let me show you another example of this. This was done by Kathleen Vos. It was a study published in Science in 2006. She had a slightly different method. What she did in some of her studies was she had people come in and they sorted they had to make meaningful phrases out of this. So some of the people sorted neutral words, it is cold outside. Some sorted money-related words, a high-paying salary. In another study, she had people sit in front of a computer screen with a screensaver on, and they either saw fish floating by or dollar signs floating by. Okay? So she's very subtly activating the idea of money in people's minds. Money is one of those power achievement values. Okay? Then she measured various helping behaviors. So she had a very similar design to the Mayo one I just mentioned. Here's the amount of time that people spent helping. After they had either had neutral or money-related words activated, so less than half amount of time spent volunteering. In another study, what she did at the end of the study is she said, thanks for being in the study, here's $2. And she gave the person 8 American quarters. And then she said, you know, we're collecting money for the University Student Fund in case students ever have an emergency, they can apply to it and get $20. Would you be willing to donate some of your honorarium back? And she measured how much of the quarters they gave back. People in the neutral conditions donated about 5 of the quarters. People in the money condition donated only 3. So just by activating money unconsciously in people's minds, it diminished pro-social behaviors because those are the values on the other side of the circumplex. Now the flip side of the seesaw effect is what we call the bleed-over effect. And what we mean by the bleed-over effect is that by activating one set of values, you actually also activate other values that are consistent with it. So if we activate universalism values in somebody's mind, we're also going to be activating the self-direction and the benevolence values because those values are psychologically consistent with the universalism values. They won't be activated as strong as the universalism values, but they'll still be somewhat activated. The way I think of this is that probably what's happening in your mind is that you have a set of neural networks that concerns universalism values. And just by turning, like if I say to you, doctor, immediately what happens in your mind is you're going to be thinking nurse at some subconscious level as well. Similar, because all those ideas are intertwined around medical professions. Similarly, for values, it seems that by activating the idea of a universalism, we activate psychologically consistent values. Here's some evidence that shows that this works this way. So this was a study we just published this last year in the United States. What we did was we brought university students into the lab and we primed them with one of 5 identities. So there's 5 different groups here. Some of the people were asked to think, well, what does it mean to be a human? Some were asked to think, what does it mean to be a University of Missouri student? Some were asked to think, what does it mean to be American? Then we had 2 more American conditions. Some were asked what it meant to be an American after reminding them that America is a place where you can come and you can make a lot of money, and you can work your way to the top, or you can go to Hollywood and become a movie star. And some of them were reminded that America is a place where freedom is very important, where family values are very important, and where our country has a long history of being generous. So, what I want you to notice is nowhere was the environment mentioned. We never mentioned the environment in the priming. Then what we did, though, was we said, now imagine that the President of the United States has put you in charge of setting environmental policy for 5 years from now. And so what we want you to do is we want you to think about 5 years from now, what would the average American be doing in terms of 11 different things which had to do with ecological footprint. So how much meat would the average American eat? How often would the average American bicycle? How big would the average American's house be? Okay, so we used the standard ecological footprint measure, but it was for a recommendation. It was basically a policy recommendation for the average American. And here's what we found, was that just by priming those intrinsic identities, never mentioning the environment, people recommended significantly lower ecological footprints than any other condition. Okay? I'll note, and this is again an aside, that actually the worst recommendations were just by priming the American condition. And those were actually, even though this looks different, it's not statistically different here between these two. So it seems that getting people to think about it being an American is more or less the same as getting them to think about being an extrinsic American, at least for this kind of an outcome. But the important point to take away is that the intrinsic group, even though we never mentioned the environment, made more sustainable recommendations because of the bleed over effect. So, what I hope you can see that we can add to the list of characteristics of values that Rich started us off with each other with is that, first off, values are dynamically related to each other. That is, it doesn't make sense to talk about a value by itself, because values exist in motivational systems such that if you tug on one value, it's going to have ripple effects throughout that system, activating certain values and suppressing other values. Okay? We also know that values are ordered by importance. Some bosses are power hungry. Okay? Other bosses do mostly care about universalism. But regardless of the extent to which your boss is power hungry or universalistically oriented, we can engage either set of those values. Okay, we can turn them on and influence the person's behavior, at least for a little while. So, I'd like to pause here.